So yeah, the book is called The Puzzle Master, and it is puzzly. I love that adjective. Actually, I think I'm going to, going to take that and use it from now on. It's a very puzzly book, in structure and in theme, and the characters. All of it sort of revolves around puzzles. The Puzzle Master is a novel about a puzzle constructor named Mike Brink, who is brought to a prison upstate where a woman who's been convicted of murder has drawn a mysterious puzzle, and he's been asked to solve it. And as soon as he begins solving the intricacies of this puzzle, he's drawn into an ancient mystery that takes him into questions of consciousness and immortality and religion.
So I am just going to dive right into talking about the book. And kind of one of the first observations I have about this, first of all, charmed by the book in so many different ways. And I think that I was like struggling to think about how I was going to approach this because there's so many elements to it. So that's the first thing I'm going to say is that there's like a bunch of different elements to this book in a book called Puzzle Master, where it's almost like all these things kind of fit together in a puzzly way. So, yeah, it seems like it's a lot to contend with, getting it all to work together. Was it a challenge at all?
So yeah, the book is called The Puzzle Master, and it is puzzly. I love that adjective. Actually, I think I'm going to take that and use it from now on. It's a very puzzly book, in structure and in theme, and the characters. All of it sort of revolves around puzzles. And just to give a little bit of backstory, the main character of this book is a man who is an ingenious puzzle solver, and he's brought to a prison in upstate New York to solve a puzzle that a prisoner has drawn. And so that's the front story, right? But then, as you mentioned, there are all of these different elements that are sort of bubbling up in the background. There's a kind of horror element of, the prisoner's backstory of how she got to prison, which I actually sort of dramatize and put in the novel. And then there's an even backstory, like two steps back, set in late 19th century Prague, that explains what happened in that house, that brought that character, Jess Price, into the situation where she would go to prison. So yeah, there's a lot of layers. People who have read it have told me that the layers are something that entangles them in a kind of way. Like as they go, they're sort of lifting up these layers and they feel enmeshed in it, and they don't really want to leave until they understand how they go together. So that's a long way to answer the question that, yes, it was a little bit complicated to put together. And that was by design. I don't think you can really call a book The Puzzle Master and have it be a very simplistic structure, which is what I'm contending with now. I'm writing a follow-up book called The Puzzle Box to this, and it has to be complicated, right? Yeah. Otherwise, it's not going to live up to its name. So yes, and as a writer, I really enjoy that element of writing, is finding how all the pieces go together, how these characters relate to each other, how our puzzle solver becomes involved with this woman in prison, and how their story together answers the puzzle, which is ultimately what happens, right? Like he becomes involved and her information helps him solve this sort of ancient mystery.
Yeah. And one of the observations I made about the way it all ties together is like the kind of generationality of it. So there's like the things that are happening in the present time, things that happened in the recent past, things that happened in the farther distant past, and where like they kind of all answer each other. So even a thing that you didn't mention is that there's kind of a tech conspiracy as part of the book. And like, so the present day tech conspiracy, how that ties into the kind of religious stuff is folded together with the stuff that happened more recent. So like, what I'm getting at is like, it all works, and it works over a spectrum of time in a way where it's like, it's nice that it's not just like all these dominoes happen right now. It's like this bubbled up because of because of a passion of this family member, which leads us to this thing from the way past and everything. So, I feel like you must have tried, like you were saying, tried really hard to weave everything together in a way that made it all fit, because it's intricate.
Yeah, I mean the I just got a Kirkus review, which I don't really like to read the reviews, but people have sent them to me, so I have read it, and it calls it it describes it as the Kabbalah meets the New York Times crossword puzzle, which I thought was like a really good way to bring two completely disparate things together, right, in one
Sure.
sentence, and it kind of does describe, I think, the nature or the texture of this book, because these elements, you're right, there's a sci-fi element in some ways, or like a tech element, which personally I don't feel like is so sci-fi, honestly.
No,
Like the
right.
way that I've written it and the way that I sort of view the world, I don't see the things that happen in the book which deal with questions of immortality and what happens to consciousness after death, and can we capture consciousness in tech in some way. Like I don't feel like that's so sci-fi and that we're so far away from that.
Right.
But there's that element, and then there's a horror element, as I mentioned, where there's this sort of haunted porcelain doll, and that seems like a really disparate thing to go side by side with those questions. But then you think, I mean, for me anyway, as an author and as a creative person sort of questioning these things, can I pull out this thing about immortality and haunting and spirits, and where does that come from, this idea of the archaeology, if you think about it, of immortality? And then it brought me back to thoughts of like the golem, right, and
Yep.
religious themes that have been circulating through literature forever. So they seem, I think, on the surface as being very different, but in my mind, when you start digging a little bit deeper, these questions are very, very similar. And another reader once sort of said that it's ancient magic sort of meeting future magic, and I love that conflation of these things, because it does sort of revolve. I mean, if someone 200 years ago looked at us, what we're doing right now, they would
Yeah.
be like, oh my God, alchemy, right?
Yeah.
Like, what the hell's going on here? These people are in two different countries talking to each other, and it's like in real time, it'd blow their mind. So, I do think that's the purpose of writing for me, right? Is to make those connections and to help readers enjoy like the process of making those connections. All of that, goes into my love of puzzles and how I feel like this book allows people to, in some ways, feel like they're solving a puzzle as they go through it. They're like, okay, that answers that question, and that answers that one, and it's an enjoyable, fun process.
I can go in like 8 directions because there's a lot of things that maybe think about. One thing I was thinking about that I think that you did well with this book is, I think that, and I think Sadie Hartman was talking about how it kind of defies classification, because there's a lot, and even how we've been talking about it so far, it doesn't necessarily sit just in one genre. But there's definitely like an action / thriller kind of thing going on. And I think about how I've read stories that, weren't for me, where it's just like chasing a thrill after a thrill after thrill and not finding something deeper in the story. And I'm not going to criticize that, because sometimes that's fun. And like people sometimes just want that kind of thing. But with your story, it is thrilling and it's suspenseful and it's got those elements to it, but it also manages to have you kind of analyze deeper thoughts about, like you said, like spiritual stuff or religious stuff, or like how all that kind of ties together. So I think one of the satisfying things about this book was that it did kind of challenge me to think deeper, even outside of the puzzle stuff, just like think about those things more.
So you just hit on something that I was thinking about myself. as I'm working on a new book, as I said. And so every day I'm like trapped in my little office, like banging my head against the desk, trying to think about why I'm doing this. And for me, writing, so first of all, this is a thriller. Like, I think the overall genre is a thriller. It's classified as a thriller or a mystery, right? Mm-hmm. But for me, if there's not something deeper in the movement through the book, like if the thing that's discovered at the end or the outcome or the payoff is like, oh yeah, she gets the guy, or yeah, they get the money from the heist, or oh yeah, they figured out who killed his family, right? Like that sort of like baseline thriller genre trope is really boring to me. Like, mm-hmm. I love the action of thrillers and I like the fast pace. But if it doesn't have a bigger sort of intellectual engagement for me, I'm out. Like in film too, right? Like I like the pace of Fast and Furious, but if there's nothing there, like that's engaging me intellectually, I'm not there with them. So in all of my books, in some way, I like to make it interesting for myself intellectually, and I ask a question. And I guess the overall question of this book has to do with consciousness, right? And what our brain is capable of. And that brings me back to Mike Brink, who is the hero. And I'll just tell people a little bit about him because he was a sort of average guy as a teenager. He was a football player. He was really good at it. He had all of this potential to become a college football player, and he was injured on the field. And the left hemisphere of his brain was damaged in a way that he developed something called sudden savant syndrome, which is an actual medical condition, very, very rare. But what it does is the people who acquire this suddenly have a skill that they didn't have before. And for some people, it's like foreign languages, and some people it's music. There's a story of one guy who just started playing these amazing classical pieces after having a brain injury. And this fascinated me when I first started reading about this condition. And so this character developed an ability to do higher math. He has a photographic memory, and he's really, really good at solving puzzles of all sorts. And so his way of entering into the question of what is consciousness is through a brain injury and through what his brain can do. We have on this other side, this tech guy entering into the question of what is consciousness by can it survive our body and what does it do? And then we have in this other way, the spiritual question of what is the soul, and can that be moved from being to being? And so all of this is to say is that the sort of overriding question that I posed for myself when writing this book was, what is consciousness? Just a small question, but it's something I wanted to explore, just a little thing to explore. But it's not just like, do they get the money at the end, or right. Do they? Like, I really wanted to set the bar high, which is not always easy, and it doesn't please everybody, I think, because some people want to have that very kind of clear, easy ending. And those questions that are so enormous and that have stumped people for thousands and thousands of years are not going to be wrapped up easily in a novel.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, so like, I usually don't talk about, I'm as careful about spoilers as you want me to be. And I usually don't talk about endings, obviously, especially since the book isn't out for another couple months ish. But I will say that the ending really poses something to think about in a religious way that I was not expecting. So there was a little bit of a revelation on that side of things, which I loved. I thought it was fantastic. But I also came up non-religious. So one of the things about the book that I was concerned about, anytime there's a religion that's built into a book, or reference in a book, I'm always concerned that part's not going to feel like make sense to me, because I don't have like the prior reference knowledge for
Right.
it. But with the way that the religion part of it was incorporated, I felt like you, through the flashbacks to the past and everything, did a great job of not putting anybody in a situation where they wouldn't understand how this is significant or relevant. So I just said a bunch of stuff, and I think that was it was inspired by praising. There was kind of a little revelation at the end on the religious side of things, but in addition to the general consciousness piece, there's like a greater kind of like existence piece to it too.
Yeah, yeah. And so the religious piece, so the puzzle, the main puzzle in the book is called the God puzzle, right? So yeah, there is a kind of element of religion, but I would almost say that it's almost like an archaeological element or like an
Sure.
ancient artifact element of religion. I'm really interested in so the kind of maps and artifacts, I guess you could say, or tools that religious people have used to find their way towards some sort of spirituality. And one of them that I found when I was doing research about the topic that is in the book, it were these 13th century prayer circles that a mystic named Abulafia had created. And for everyone who's listening to this or watching this, you can go to the British Library and just Google like British Library Abulafia prayer circles or Torah or something along those lines. And up will come an interactive document where you can actually look through them through this book.
Wow.
Of 13th century, amazingly beautiful and very mysterious looking symbols that he made. And no one, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, right? I'm not an expert on Kabbalah or Abulafia, but from what I gathered when I was doing this research, these circles were used as devices to sort of create a kind of conscious experience where you could experience a mystical revelation or something, right? And I found that completely fascinating. It's almost like, someone, dropping acid or, to, have a revelation or microdosing to like think differently, right? But this is the
Mm-hmm.
13th century and it's with a text.
Right.
So yeah, but the danger of using something like that is exactly as what you said, like it could really confuse or throw some people or scare people away. So I was really careful to make it simple, like it's all that information that I just said is in some way in the book. It's explained by a character and it's just said outright. So there's no prior information that you need to bring into the book.
Yep.
Which I think, I mean, oh my goodness, if I like expected people to know this stuff before coming into the book, it would be impossible, right? So, and it is, I think that ending, the ending of that thread, that, the God puzzle solution is a huge part of the book and like something that I really wanted to be in the book and constructed a lot so that I could have that in the book. It's not the most, it's not, I wouldn't say it's not something that is dominating the book,
Right.
right? It really comes in at the end. And I feel like people who have read it and have talked to me about it said that like, it's like such a fun ride, right?
Yeah.
Through it that like when you get to this kind of serious thing at the end, it's like, oh, and then there's that. And there's that too, right? So yeah, I hope, I mean, I don't know, I can't ever read my book for the first time, but I hope that it feels like, that the book itself is an experience that's really fun. And then this other thing at the end is a payoff that feels meaningful, right? Like that's the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And balanced too. And one thing I would say that I didn't really think about till you were talking earlier was not necessarily, I'm going to say this in awkward ways and then maybe you can refine it or tell me I'm wrong, but like the whole idea of, how they were doing things in the past and how Jameson Sedge is trying to do things in the present day are either kind of analogs for each other or like just doing the same thing in a way that we based on what we have available to us now. So like incorporating technology because it exists, whereas in the past it was doing things a different way, but like still trying to get the same result, just doing things in a different way. Does that make sense what I'm
Yeah, it
saying?
totally does. And my response to that is like, I don't think human beings have changed,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Like, I think, given the tools that we have now, human beings 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago would have the same goals that we
Yeah.
do, which is love, comfort, and meaning, right? And in Jameson Sedge's case, longevity, or trying to live beyond our frail, limited bodies. So yeah, I think I think that's an interesting point. And something that I find, it's not conscious, but when I look back at my work, this is the fourth novel I've written, and all of them have this element of kind of archaeological layering or whatever, of like digging in the past in some way. Like I had a novel called Angelology where there was, a section that was like 75 pages long of someone in the year 2000, right? Like, so clearly that's something that's of interest to me. I would like to write a book, I think maybe my next one, that doesn't have that, just to see what happens. But who knows? We'll see.
So maybe for a reader, when they see how things were done, in the past, and see how things are being done kind of with a similar goal outcome in the present, it does kind of illustrate that like overall the whole time we've just been trying to do the same thing, but like using different tools or whatever.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, in the way that the direction that Mike Brink, the main character, is going is, a direction that in my mind sort of proves that, right? Like that, the cerebral elements that he sort of embodies leads him back again and again to some basic elements of like love and connection with people. One of his big problems is that he just, this injury gave him a kind of superpower, right? Like he can look at a situation that you and I would look at, and he would see it in an absolutely different way. But at the same time, it's made him really removed from other people. And while he really tries to connect with people, that's hard. So, I think one of the things that draws me to that character and why I want to write a second book and why I've written this book about him is just that dichotomy between all of us who are so in our heads sometimes, and then the physical world and other people and connecting with them and watching this character struggle, right? He struggles the whole book to make a connection with someone. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but there it is.
Well, there is the love story aspect of it. So we can kind of shift to that, where I, with the Mike Brink and Jess Price characters, walked away from the story feeling like there wasn't selfish goals there. Like their goal was just to be happy. It was very personal and stuff, whereas opposed to like some of the other, players in the story were a little bit more ambitious or greedy or selfish or whatever that is. And I really, from them, just felt like it was just these two kind of beings that the world was encroaching on their happiness in a way. So
That's so interesting that you say that. Yeah, because those two really, I mean, Jess Price, she's the woman who finds the porcelain doll and ends up, everything goes very bad and she ends up in prison. And it's true, her ambition, her great ambition in the book is really just to have herself back, right? Quite literally. And also I think by the end to do the same thing that Mike Brink, the puzzle master character, wants to, is to have a connection with another human being. So I feel like that, I think you're right. Like it's a very kind of simple connection, one that's very human and one that all of us hopefully find, with another person at some point. Whereas, Jameson Sedge, that's the tech guy, right? That's the guy who, I'm not going to say too much about what he does, but he does all these wild things. He's very ambitious. And even, if you think about the other characters, I suppose maybe, there's a villain character, Cam Putney, although I would argue that he's not so villainous, although he is a villain, but I like him a lot, which might speak to, the kind of people I like. But I feel like he's very understandable, right, as a character, because his motivations for doing what he does, he's kind of like a henchman for Sedge in some ways, sort of acting out what Sedge needs him to do, the violence and so on in the book. He's doing it for a reason that we can all understand, right? He's a single father, or sometimes a single father. He's with his daughter. He's divorced and he has a daughter, and he's very protective of her and has been able to give her this better life because of the things he's doing, which are very morally, in a gray area, if not completely illegal. So, I mean, I feel what I think that you were saying, or how I'm interpreting what you were saying, is that the character, the motivations and the emotions in the book are relatively relatable. And, when sort of put in front of this background of kind of crazy religious stuff and wild tech stuff, it gives for me anyway, and what I hope to do is that it creates a very relatable entry point into those ideas and into the story. And hopefully it keeps you engaged because you want to spend time with those people.
Yes, I'll agree. And I'll even go so far as to say that Jameson Sedge gets that treatment to a degree as well, where even though ostensibly he could be labeled the bad guy, in times learning about kind of his goals or plans or just the general concept, sometimes it doesn't sound that bad. Like sometimes it just sounds like it's just like curiosity with a budget, basically, is kind of what it sounds like sometimes.
Right. Curiosity with endless money. Yeah. Right. And also, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? Like there's a spectrum of what we do every day. Like we take our vitamins and we watch our weight, and, we want to live longer than, I don't know, 100 years ago, people were living to 45, right? And now the lifespan is, early 80s or something. So there's a spectrum of wanting to live, how long we want to live and what we'll do to live longer. Whether that's moving in a direction, I think it might be in the future with, bioengineering and various other things that humans could do to extend their life, using AI or using different kinds of technology, using different kinds of storage, to keep our consciousness forever, alive. All of those things feel like a spectrum to me. And as I was saying before, it's a very human spectrum, right? There's not that much difference from that and, a Greek who is, praying for immortality or, doing all of these things to live longer, and sort of projecting themselves into godlike, with godlike figures that have the power to do all the things that Jameson Sedge is trying to do. So it's fun to think about, right? For me, all of this is very fun to think about. But I will say it sounds, pretty heady and kind of brainy, but the real skill for me, the hardest thing that I did in writing this book was not the research or not, these thoughts about, sort of expressing thoughts about consciousness and all of this. It was really in making this feel like a game or a puzzle, and feel like once you fell in, it was enjoyable and light enough to pull you through. So that was my biggest challenge, I think, as an author.
Well, and I guess to that point, I don't know if we acknowledged it directly, but yeah, it's I think it's between 300 and 400 pages. So it's a handful of pages, but man, it's got a good pace to it. So I would say for people who are worried about something that so far we're talking about, like you said, a lot of really kind of high
I know it
concept
sounds
stuff.
like Umberto Eco or something, right? Like very heavy and like
Yeah, it paces wonderfully. So it's easy to read and easy to follow along with, even though it's got a lot going on. So like you were saying, that probably had to be challenging to not get mired down and not sacrifice pace for loading it up with all this thought.
totally. I mean, I cut so many pages from it. It was much longer. Um, and for example, there's a section in Prague, which is one of my favorite sections of the book, and it was twice as long originally. Much more research was layered in, and it just felt too heavy, right? Like, and so I cut it, and that's very hard to do, as you can imagine. But
Yeah.
Something that I guess I've learned over the course of writing a few books is that the overall product is so much more important to me than that particular chapter or that particular section. And if someone walks away saying, "Oh, that really felt like a fluid read," right? Like it was consistent throughout. Like,
Yeah.
the beginning was the same vibe as the end in some ways. Then I'm really happy about that, and I feel like it was a successful endeavor.
Yeah, I think you pulled it off. So it's definitely one thing that listeners should feel good about, is that, or rest easy if they're worried about that, is like it's got a great and consistent pace to it. Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, one of the element of the book, which wasn't present a lot, but is fascinating, is the whole doll aspect of it. So there's like you had said, a kind of a, did you say possessed doll?
I said a haunted doll. Yes.
Haunted doll. So there's that doll.
There's that doll. Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
As my publicist says, she's like, eek.
Right.
Oh, doll.
But there's the way the history of it, and it ties into this kind of prestigious doll maker, and we get to see a lot of the history of that doll maker and their craft. So did you have to do some, was dolls something that you cared about before, and then B, how much research was involved in incorporating that?
So yeah, I was not interested really in dolls per se. I've always been really freaked out by porcelain dolls. I feel like they're really creepy looking. And, I went to a museum in Newport, Rhode Island. That's like a porcelain doll museum. And you walk in and it just feels like there's trouble brewing, right? Like something's going to happen. And also I didn't really think about this until I started writing the book, but my great grandmother had a porcelain doll that she left my mother, and then my mother has given it to me. And that kind of transmission of babies that, women give to their daughters, then they give them to their daughters. And this sort of almost simulacrum of motherhood or maternal grooming in some way, like preparing girls to be mothers, like has always freaked me out. And I'm not really the most maternal person in some ways. In some ways I am, I suppose. But I became fascinated with the history of porcelain dolls because they really are an art form. If you start to dig and look at how they were made in the 19th century and early 20th century, there's some amazing German and French bisque porcelain dolls. And I actually spoke with an expert from Sotheby's. She was at Sotheby's, and then she moved, and she's now teaching. She's a professor of porcelain. And a character in my book is based on that woman that I that I found. But anyway, and she told me so much about the history of porcelain dolls. And so then I began reading about it. And La Moriette, the character who writes the letter, he's the doll maker that's in the book. he is based on a real French doll maker. And I found, documents about the store that his family owned and the methods that he used. It's all fiction, of course, right? Like I've changed a lot, and him going to Prague, totally fiction. But it gave me like the material, and I don't know, it gave me the confidence to write about something like that, because whenever a kind of supernatural element comes into a story, first of all, I love supernatural elements coming into stories, but my first instinct as a writer is you have to have all of the other stuff and the research really grounded and like 100% there, so that it feels real. Because even just a little touch of the supernatural, like it has to be so weighted on the other side, like really researched and real feeling for me anyway. So yeah, the porcelain doll part. And then I think, what was the other question? Did I like porcelain dolls before? And
what kind of research you were doing?
Okay. So I answered both of those. Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of research, and I'll send you a picture of my grandmother's porcelain doll.
Cool.
In the show notes if you want, if you have those.
That'd be awesome.
And it's really quite scary. So, it's enough to inspire, a crime in a novel, because this is all the backstory, right? Like this is the crime that happened through Jess Price, I'll say, right? Like that landed her in prison, that put her in this position where she needed the puzzle master to come in and solve this puzzle and help her get out of it. So like all of that I just was describing is really, a fraction of the novel. It's the backstory. But I think you mentioned that you felt this way too earlier. It really, it makes that front story feel really understandable in a way that if you just, said all of the stuff that happened, if you just narrated it rather than dramatizing it, I think it would be harder to believe.
You're 100% right about that. And now I was thinking about, and this is where I'm probably not you can fill in gaps if you feel like it's not spoiling things, but I liked how the making of the porcelain doll back when it was made had an element of we have a person who is like a master crafts person,
right? And
we're going to ask them to do something for us without really kind of explaining what the goal is. Like we just, we're going to have him make this thing for us. And the idea that it took something of such like perfect, amazing craftsmanship to kind of achieve their more kind of supernatural goal or whatever.
Right.
I thought that was cool. But then I think about Mike Brink with his abilities being used to solve puzzles, not knowing what those puzzles were being used for. So there was kind of an element of that in the past and in the present as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we ever know, do we? Like,
yeah.
We never know what our art is being used for. Or, when we make something, I always like, just to, with me, with writing a book, I always hope that people take good things from it. But, people are individuals with different perspectives, and people can interpret things in any way they want. I love that you brought up the process of making the porcelain doll, because that's like what, so much was cut. Like, I feel like I'm going to send you this whole longer section, because I did so much research into how porcelain works, right? Because porcelain is in itself, not to bore people here, but it's really a fascinating substance. And it's one that until I think the 17th century, Europeans did not know how it was made, right? It was a Chinese art, and it was a technology that China had created, but no one in the West could figure it out. And that in itself is a totally fascinating story about how it was at one point valued more than gold, like these very fragile things. And so the history of porcelain making in some way funnels into my story through that doll that gets made, because of course, the doll maker likes to talk about the process, as all of us artists like to do. And Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And that was something that was interesting to you because it's fascinating. Where, going back to what I was saying about getting too bogged down in that, right? Like as for everyone out there who's listening, who's a writer, you know what I mean? Like it's easy to fall in love with things like that, like with the research or the setting. For this is another fault of mine, is I can fall in love with a setting and write 10 pages about the beautiful architecture and the way that the fabric folded and blah blah blah. Like I could go on forever. And in Angelology, my first novel, I sometimes did, right? Like
Okay.
I really just let myself go and like was very descriptive about stuff that was not related to the plot. So in this book, it was very important to me to keep layers of that or touches of that, of the research, keep it in, but cut out all the fat so that it moved at a pace that would be enjoyable.
Well, it's good you didn't cut the whole thing because, like you said, it is one of those topics that you don't know how interesting it is until someone kind of gives you a glimpse of that. So, yeah, that was really fascinating. And if you have like cut scenes you're going to send me, like, I absolutely welcome it because that sounds
Oh
awesome.
my God. Actually, I will. I'm thinking about putting that whole chapter, like the cut chapters on my website and just being like, if you really loved this porcelain stuff, here's more.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Because there is more.
The descriptiveness thing you mentioned made me think of, in my mind, I was calling it like the Anne Rice problem, because I haven't read much Anne Rice, but the couple of books that I've read, she is just phenomenal at describing like furniture and like stuff like that in a way where it's like that was a whole page just describing like the
Right.
furniture in a room. And it was, to me, something that was distracting, but it's obvious that that's something that, in her mind is like an important part of the story or whatever. But to me, it was like, okay, can we learn about the vampires or whatever, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I get that. And what's interesting is that when I was a kid, when I was like 13 and 14, I was devouring Anne Rice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people who are interested in art and design and stuff like that, they do get a little bit caught up in the artistic details of whether it's paintings or whether it's this velvet chair or whatever that Anne Rice writes so well about. But I think as time goes on for me, right, I got it out of my system. I mean, I still like to have it there, right? I think that having those sort of gorgeous descriptions that's important to me. And I've read so many books. I'm the horror columnist for the New York Times Book Review. I don't know if I mentioned, if we talked about that, but so I get a lot of novels, right? I read a lot, and I do read horror. I read thrillers. I read mystery. I read a lot. And it's something over the course, I think, of my life as a writer, but also as a reader, you just internalize when it's too much, right? And I think for me as a beginning writer, I just loved doing that so much that I just let myself do it, and no one stopped me, right? Like none of my editors were like, cut this, get this out of here. And still they wouldn't, I think. My editor is a wonderful editor, but I think she is respectful and wouldn't cut out my prose. It was me who, I was the one who decided, let's cut this down and make it faster.
Sure. And I've gotten to a point in my time of talking about books where I try my best not to talk bad about things. So like there's probably people who are like, man, I just love the way that this feels when they're reading an Anne Rice book and stuff. So like, great, like
Really?
I'm sure that that's a great reading experience for people. But there's like, I feel like the challenge as an author, which I am not, so I'm just interpreting. There's the challenge of crafting the story you want to craft. There's, incorporating all the elements that are necessary, making sure it all makes sense. There's like all these things, but then there's like an efficiency of the way that you say things. That's and like an additional art that is like just another challenge you have to throw on top of all the other stuff you have to do. So,
especially if you're writing, like I've decided like that the genre of this series is sort of the overarching genre is a thriller, right? If you decide to write a thriller, it has to move. Like
Yeah.
the art of
It's crucial.
compression. The art of compression is key, but I still
Yeah.
want it to be me, right? Like I came from like a literary, I hate these categories, by the way, but since we're talking about genre and, you mentioned there's all these genres within my books, I came from kind of a literary background, or so-called literary. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop where plot was not really a thing, right? Like it was the poetry of the words on the page, the emotions of the characters in the short story. And one, I don't write short stories, and two, while I am interested in character and emotion, I really like story. Like I grew up, as I said, reading Anne Rice, Stephen King, V.C. Andrews. Like those were the books that like would sort of maroon me in a chair in the library, and I wouldn't get up till it was done. And so yeah, it was really a learning process for me to unlearn the so-called literary tropes and learn how to do these other ones. But at the same time, I want me in my books. So, walking that line between who am I and what is my vision as a person, which does tend to skew more literary in some ways, but also encompasses fast writing and exciting sequences and concepts like that are the ones that I explore in this book. All of that has to be wrapped into one thing. And so maybe this form, this like puzzly form, as you called it, the puzzly book, is maybe the best fit for me, because I'm kind of, I'm not one thing.
Yeah, and I think the overall thought for me on that is there's nothing that got left behind in this book.
That's such a nice thing to say. Yeah.
So, yeah,
which was like, behind. I think Joyce Carol Oates. I think I heard her say this, or I read a quote somewhere that when she finishes a book, she's like, "Oh, okay, I can die now." Like there's this feeling that when you finish a book and there's nothing left behind, you can say, "Okay, that's me." Like if I leave something for this world, there it is. And it's true. I feel like in the Puzzle Master, I put all of me in there. I put different character points of view, men and women, past and present, all the kind of things that I'm interested in, the kind of writing I like. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that, because, I work alone in a little box of a room and I don't hear feedback very often.
All of this, and we haven't really talked too much about puzzles specifically, but so I talked about this book a lot to my girlfriend as I was reading it. And when I was just kind of giving her the general, what the jacket says about the book, she was excited about the idea of puzzle masters and like an actual like person whose occupation is a puzzle person. And she mentioned, oh man, I have to look it up because I can't remember the guy from.
Is it Will Shortz?
Yeah. She's like kind of like Will Shortz. And I was like, it's funny you mentioned it. She has like a specific acknowledgement in the book about the puzzle specific people who inspired and helped and everything. And she mentioned him. And she's like, yeah, I wonder how she, connected to him. And I was like, well, she writes for the New York Times, so I wonder if that had anything to do with it. But
it wasn't through that. A friend who used to work with him somewhere gave me his email address, and I just cold called. I just sent him an email and said, "Hi, I'm writing this novel. It involves puzzles. I happen to not live that far from him. He lived like an hour south of me I lived upstate New York, and he lived in Westchester somewhere. And I said, can we talk? And he so very generously said yes, and invited me to his house, and he showed me his puzzle collection, and which is completely amazing, by the way. And unlike anything I had seen before, of course. So yeah, that experience really laid the foundation, again, for feeling confident to write about that subject. Of course, I did a lot of reading. And then also, I am not a puzzle person. I like the idea of puzzles more than I actually like sitting down and doing them, which I think is why this this as a concept was really cool for me to do and to work on. But I get very frustrated if I get stuck in a puzzle and can't get out, because I want to finish it, right? Like, and if I can't finish it, it's just very frustrating. So I worked with 2 professional puzzle constructors to actually there's some puzzles in the book that act as plot points. And so I had 2 puzzle constructors, one who's really great with words and crosswords and one who's really great with numbers. And they both helped me make the puzzles, the actual puzzles.
That's awesome. I also think that it's great that you specifically gave credit to them as part of the book, as like its own kind of special section. How did that go? So was that something that as you were writing the book, you were coordinating with them, like as the book was being written, or was it like before, after, something like that?
So I had a draft and I knew I needed a puzzle like in this place. And I knew I needed another puzzle in this place. And so then I talked to them and said, what kind of puzzle do you think would go well here? And Brendan, he's the word guy, right? And he even suggested, there's some word puzzles that he suggested that we try, right? And together, he would construct it and I would play with it and see if it worked in the book. And if it did, we would keep it. And if it didn't, I would say, can we try something else? So it was really collaborative, which is why I do give them credit. I mean, without them, there would be no puzzles in the book at all.
Yeah. I think it's kind of neat that you gave them a puzzle-making puzzle in a way, because it had to fit into a specific already kind of made thing.
Oh, believe me, I'm sure Brendan wasn't that thrilled actually. Like the new book, he just created one for me, and it was one of those that took many rounds of going back and forth.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I wonder if it's coincidental or not, but recently me and my girlfriend have been doing these. There's these little things that are like exit rooms in a box. They're like little, like, it's like basically a series of riddles that you have to like figure out to like get to the goal. And they're like, we got the novice one, which is like 10-year-olds should be able to figure this out. And we're sitting down and we're going through this thing, the 2 of us together. And it's just like, we're reasonably intelligent people and just banging our heads together. And I think the thing that I would always go back to is if they're giving us this, they gave us a way to find the answer. So we have to have faith that it's somewhere here. Like, it's not unsolvable. So like, yeah, there's a whole kind of puzzle mentality I get into to get through those things. And it's just little riddles and stuff. But yeah, it's a deal.
Yeah. I mean, that's when I say that, like, I love the concept of puzzles, but then if I get stuck in one, I kind of panic because I really want to solve it. And, sometimes I'm not that terrible at them. I do crossword puzzles and I do Wordle almost every day. And, I love word puzzles, but, yeah, there's something about them. And the more, I think about it, have thought about it after finishing writing The Puzzle Master, is like how narrative is kind of like a puzzle, right? And especially a mystery or a thriller, where you're given these clues, these sets of circumstances, and you're sort of entrapped in the rules of that game or that puzzle.
Exactly.
And the puzzle constructor, which I guess would be me with the novel, is funneling you into certain situations that make you react in certain ways and make you feel things and allow you to connect with ideas and people that you wouldn't have done before. And so for me, I think the biggest revelation in writing this book was really that how much of a puzzle experience writing is, from finding the plot to executing it, like writing it, to even publishing. Like, all of it is very much a puzzle experience, a puzzly experience.
A puzzly experience. That's so true. And I probably talk too much about like storytelling and stuff like that, just in my non-podcast life, where to me, there's a big thing in storytelling where it's like, when you establish this thing had this consequence, at the beginning of the book, and then you reinforce it by doing a similar thing with a similar outcome later in the book. To me, you're telling me this is a rule of the story so that I can expect later on when those type, like you're setting up guidelines, you're drawing me down a path or whatever. So I totally agree with you that whether it's intentional or not, the construction of a story definitely has that element to it where it's like rules and things like that. There's a structure to it that there's a logic to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a really archetypal human one, right? Like we love it. Like even, you could read the Bible as like a horror novel or a mystery, like very ancient texts are about finding meaning and having narrative consequences. And, this person married this person and had this child who grew up and did this horrible thing or that wonderful thing, right? Like all of that is human nature and narrative. And I think what has been so fun about the Puzzle Master is that I'm kind of making it more meta. Right. Like I'm taking all this underlying stuff that we all kind of understand physically almost, or, archetypally in our lives about storytelling and making it really sort of on the surface of the book and playing with it. And that's really fun. I hope that people feel that, that connection.
Yeah. Well, and then I was thinking too, like you said at some point earlier in the conversation about magic, the way that a story is told, the author is basically doing something to make you feel a certain way so that the outcome feels kind of magical in a way too. So like it's another form of it can be interpreted as magic.
Yeah. I mean, transporting us, right? Like my favorite authors transport me someplace. And, however they do that, whether it's in historical fiction or a thriller or something really scary or, whatever. The best authors for me are the ones that just lift me out of my own experience and take me someplace.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. So we talked a ton about Puzzle Master, and because it's not out yet, I want to encourage everybody to pre-order and get that thing going, get your libraries to get it, all that kind of stuff. But we've talked a bunch about that. I'm curious about a couple of things, and it came up earlier that you write you write horror reviews for the New York Times, and I want to say when the New York Times shows up on the weekend, the Sunday, the first thing, my girlfriend hands me the book review, and I flip open and I see who's done reviews. So one of the first things I do is I look for your name. So you're a presence on my Sundays pretty regularly. Whether you have contributed or not, but is horror important to you, or is that just kind of what you're doing for that specific publication?
So as I think I mentioned earlier, I kind of came up reading horror novels, right? And I think I didn't, the really incredible thing about reading as a kid is that there's no filter, right? You're just picking up books. I mean, or I was paperbacks at the library and just trying them out and reading them. And the ones that really grabbed me were horror, or kind of, different genres of horror. I loved, as I said, like Anne Rice, and I loved Gothic horror. I loved Edgar Allan Poe when I was a little bit older. And, that was sort of my thing. But it went away, for me for a long time. As, I wanted to be a writer. I was going to write sort of intellectual or literary novels. I went in this path where I wrote, a sort of a memoir about my family. Like I went in this totally different path. And I love the genre and I know a lot about it, but I wouldn't say that it's like my primary genre, even though the Ancestor is considered Gothic, which is a subcategory of horror. And there are horror elements in the Puzzle Master for sure. And in Angelology as well. In all of my books, it's there. But so I was completely, I guess someone saw that in me more than I saw it in myself. And they asked me to do this column for the New York Times Book Review. It's called Dark Matters. And it combines sort of the subcategories of horror, right? There's some, like I'll do, for example, in the past, I've reviewed crime horror novels or gothic horror novels or, romantic horror novels. Like there's lots of mixing it up in horror. People think that horror is only like slasher books and just Stephen King type supernatural or, gory stuff. There's a huge range. And one of my goals as a reviewer has been to pull out these sort of different elements of horror and highlight them, and also to really show that like a lot of women write horror novels, right? Like I think in the past, and I started going through the book review actually from even 10 years ago or 15 years ago and pulling out the horror columns and reviews, and so much of it was men. And so one of my goals as a reviewer has been to highlight these sort of under respected elements of horror. And, women have been writing horror from the beginning. Mary Shelley, for example.
Literally the beginning of horror, yeah.
Literally the very beginning. And so, yeah, I love that element of it. But, I mean, to answer your question, I'm not sure that – I think I can't be really categorized as a horror writer. And I think that might be good for me as a reviewer because I'm not in the mix with those writers in the same way. Like I'm not going to StokerCon, right, and hoping to win an award. I'm not going there and people pitching me their books or whatever for the book review. It's just a very separate thing. Like I consider myself more of like literary thrillers or thrillers straight up, or supernatural thrillers, right? Like there's always an element of supernatural in my books. So yeah, it's pretty separate.
I love that you brought up the idea of like women writing horror and how that it maybe was underrepresented. And I've been thinking recently that like, it's not that suddenly there's tons of women writing fantastic horror. I feel like there's been a change where they're kind of getting more exposure maybe or something. Like it's not this
been there. Right.
Yeah, right.
There.
That's and it's just a matter of like times are changing where it's not as, I don't know, kind of like male dominated and junky maybe as it once was or whatever. But I feel like there's so many incredible voices now, but also they're there to discover from the past as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have been thrilled to sort of rediscover Daphne du Maurier, right? Who wrote The Birds, the short story The Birds that Hitchcock made into, Hitchcock took a lot of her short stories and a lot of her stories and made them into films, but also wrote Rebecca. There's just so many women writers who can be categorized as horror. That we're just seeing now, or that they've always been there, but we're able to rediscover them.
Yeah. And then kind of the final thing, because you had mentioned very surprisingly and excitingly to me that now we're talking about a series as opposed to an individual book. You're working on the new book, or is there kind of like a release date in the plans already?
So I'm working on the new book, and there's not a release date yet. Hopefully it's going to be in a year or two. I'm well into it. So I started it right after finishing The Puzzle Master. So it's called The Puzzle Box. And Mike Brink is brought to Japan to open a Japanese puzzle box that has been locked for over 150 years.
I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's very exciting. And I feel like that's kind of the lamest thing to do too. Like when I talk to an author and I'm like, what's the next thing, when you're like, I'm trying to release this thing, buddy, but I've already read it. So now I'm like, I'm hungry for more. So that's why that question always happens.
It's kind of like an author though, right? Like, at this stage, when we're talking about the book that's being published, we're working on something else. So our mind is sort of in another place.
Yeah. The other thing, someone told me once, I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Hall. He wrote the Raw Shark texts. He was talking about how he had like a good decade between the book Raw Shark texts and then the one that came out recently. So he got really good at talking about Raw archetypes because he talked about it so much. But then I talked to him at the very beginning of the release of his book, Maxwell's Demon, and he hadn't formulated a lot of his thoughts yet. So like, not only are you maybe working on another project, but now you have to go in and like think about, how do I talk about this story because I have to promote it. So that's got to be an extra layer too.
Yeah, it always is. Yeah, it's true. It's another layer. Okay.
Danielle, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and getting way into concepts I didn't think we were going to get into. It was an incredible conversation. So
It was really fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And now I regret that we didn't get to talk the same way about Ancestor back in the day.
It would have been fun. Well, we can do a makeup. We can always reschedule and do a makeup one if you want.
Yeah, well, there's always Puzzle Box too. So.
Oh yeah, there's a Puzzle Box, and you now are the ARC party, so you have to be before publication, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.